Ethan Carter had always dreamed of owning a home with a private pool. It wasn't just about the luxury. It was a symbol of his hard work and success. After years of saving and investing, he finally purchased a beautiful property in the upscale neighborhood of Willow Creek. The house was perfect, spacious, modern, and with a backyard that featured a sparkling blue pool. For Ethan, the pool was the crown jewel of his new home, a place where he could relax after long days at work and entertain friends on weekends. But Ethan's dream quickly turned into a nightmare when he met his neighbor, Maggie Thompson. Maggie was a middle-aged woman with a sharp tongue and a sense of entitlement that Ethan had never encountered before. From the moment he moved in, she made it clear that she didn't approve of him. Ethan, a successful black man in his early 30s, was used to dealing with subtle racism, but Maggie's disdain was overt and unapologetic. The first time Ethan saw Maggie in his backyard, he was shocked. He had just returned from work and was about to unwind by the pool when he noticed her lounging on one of his pool floats, sipping a drink as if she owned the place. Ethan approached her cautiously, trying to remain polite. "Excuse me, ma'am, but this is private property. You can't be here," Ethan said, his voice calm but firm. Maggie barely glanced at him. "Oh, relax. It's just a pool. We're neighbors, aren't we? What's the big deal?" Ethan was taken aback by her audacity. "The big deal is that this is my property, and you're trespassing. Please leave." Maggie rolled her eyes and waved him off like he was an annoying fly. "You're being ridiculous. This whole area was built for the community. If you can afford this place, then I should be able to enjoy it too." Ethan felt a surge of anger but held his tongue. He decided to let it go, hoping it was a one-time incident. But he was wrong. Over the next few weeks, Maggie continued to help herself to Ethan's pool. Sometimes she brought friends, turning his backyard into a party zone. Ethan tried reasoning with her, reminding her that she was trespassing, but Maggie always had an excuse. "You're being selfish," she would say. "People like you shouldn't be so uptight." Ethan's patience was wearing thin. It wasn't just the trespassing that bothered him. It was the underlying tone of her words. Maggie seemed to believe that Ethan didn't deserve the life he had built for himself. Her entitlement was rooted in something deeper, something uglier. One afternoon, Ethan confronted Maggie one last time. "Maggie, I've asked you repeatedly to stay off my property. If you want to swim, join a club or get your own pool. This is private, and you're not welcome here." Maggie's response was instant and dismissive. "That's ridiculous. People like you shouldn't be so selfish. You're lucky I even bothered to talk to you." Ethan felt his blood boil. It was clear that Maggie didn't just see his pool as hers for the taking. She saw him as someone who didn't deserve to have it. By the time she left that day, Ethan knew that being polite wasn't enough. Something had to change. Ethan had dealt with entitled neighbors before, but Maggie was something else. It was bad enough that she kept sneaking into his backyard like it was a public park, but the way she acted like his ownership was some kind of mistake made it all the more infuriating. Enough was enough. The next morning, Ethan took action. He installed a high-quality lock on the gate and added security cameras around the perimeter. He even placed a sign that read, "Private property and no trespassing." For the first time in weeks, he felt some peace. That peace lasted exactly 2 days. On the third afternoon, Ethan was inside his home when he heard a loud, rattling noise from the backyard. He checked the security feed on his phone and, unsurprisingly, there she was, Maggie, gripping the locked gate and shaking it violently. Her face was red with rage, and she was muttering to herself. Ethan could hear the occasional "unbelievable" and "how dare he" through the camera's microphone. He watched as she pulled out her phone, pacing in front of the gate. Moments later, sirens blared in the distance. Ethan already knew what was coming. Within minutes, 2 police officers arrived. Maggie rushed toward them, waving dramatically. "Thank God you're here," she shouted, pointing at the house. "That man is threatening me. He locked me out for no reason. He's trying to intimidate me." Ethan stepped outside, keeping his hands visible to avoid any trouble. "Good afternoon, officers. What seems to be the issue?" One of the cops, an older man with tired eyes, gave Ethan a once-over and then glanced at Maggie, who was panting like she had just run a marathon. "She says you threatened her," he said cautiously. Ethan didn't even blink. "I haven't spoken to her today," he replied. "But I do have security footage." Maggie's face twisted. "He's lying," she shrieked. "He's been harassing me for weeks. He put up that lock just to keep me out." Ethan pulled out his phone and tapped the screen a few times. "Actually, I put up the lock because she keeps trespassing on my private property. And I've got the video to prove it." He handed the phone to the officer, who watched the footage in silence. The video showed Maggie attempting to break into the pool area, her tantrum caught in full clarity. The second officer leaned in to watch, his eyebrows raising slightly. "Ma'am," the older cop said after a beat, his tone firm, "this is his property. You don't have any right to be here." Maggie's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. But he's being unfair. He's trying to keep me out on purpose." "Yes," Ethan said dryly. "That's exactly the point." The officers exchanged looks. One of them turned back to Maggie. "If you set foot on this property again, you'll be arrested for trespassing. Do you understand?" Maggie's face turned an alarming shade of purple. She let out a frustrated growl, spun on her heel, and stomped away. Ethan watched her go, shaking his head. He knew this wasn't over. People like Maggie didn't just let things go. They retaliated. But what she didn't know was that Ethan wasn't done either. And he had an idea that would change everything. Ethan had dealt with Maggie's type before, the kind of person who thrived on entitlement and saw themselves as superior. But Maggie wasn't just another annoying neighbor. She had a mean streak, a sense of ownership over things that didn't belong to her, and, worst of all, a complete lack of shame. After the 911 incident, Ethan expected Maggie to back off. Instead, she doubled down. He caught her glaring at him whenever he walked past her house. A few times, she even stood on her porch with her arms crossed, muttering under her breath as he went about his day. It was clear Maggie wasn't done, and neither was he. Ethan had an idea. If Maggie was going to make his life difficult, maybe it was time he learned a little more about hers. That night, he sat at his computer and started digging. First, he ran a basic background check. Nothing unusual popped up. But then he went deeper, combing through public records, old newspaper archives, and even ancestry websites. What he found made his stomach turn. Maggie's family had a long, ugly history, one that stretched back generations. Her grandfather and great-grandfather weren't just clan members. They were leaders, holding high-ranking positions in one of the most notorious branches of the KKK. There were old photos of them in full robes, standing beside burning crosses. Newspaper clippings linked them to violent rallies and hate crimes. But it didn't stop there. Maggie's parents had their own history of racist activity. While they hadn't been part of the Klan, they had donated money to white supremacist groups and even attended protests against desegregation back in the day. Ethan leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. He had suspected Maggie's entitlement ran deeper than just personal arrogance. But this was generational. No wonder she had reacted so violently to a black man owning something she felt she deserved. She had been raised to believe people like him shouldn't have success. Ethan exhaled slowly, tapping his fingers against the desk. He had all the proof he needed, but he wasn't just going to sit on it. Maggie had spent weeks trying to make his life miserable. It was time she felt the consequences of her actions. He had a plan, and she wasn't going to see it coming. Ethan had never been the type to seek revenge. He preferred to let karma do its work. But after weeks of Maggie's harassment, her false 911 call, and now the disturbing history he had uncovered, he realized something. Maggie had never faced consequences a day in her life. That was about to change. With the information he had gathered, Ethan made a call, not to the police, but to a local journalist he knew covered stories on racism and discrimination. He shared everything he had found, Maggie's entitled behavior, her false accusations, and, most importantly, her family's deep-rooted connection to the KKK. The journalist was more than interested. A day later, an exposé was published online. The headline alone was enough to make waves. Wealthy woman calls 911 on black neighbor. Her dark family secret exposed. The article detailed everything, from Maggie's history of harassment to the shocking truth about her ancestry. It wasn't just a local piece. It spread like wildfire, hitting social media and getting shared thousands of times. And Maggie? She was furious. Ethan was watering his front lawn when Maggie stormed up to his driveway, phone in hand, her face twisted in rage. "You did this," she screeched, waving the screen at him. You're trying to ruin my life." Ethan didn't even flinch. "I didn't ruin anything, Maggie. Your family did that all on their own." "You have no right," she spat. "That's all lies. My grandfather was a war hero, not some." "You can keep telling yourself that," Ethan said coolly. "But the truth's out there now, and people aren't happy." Maggie's breathing grew heavier, her body shaking. And then, in an act of pure desperation, she did the one thing that sealed her fate. She lunged at Ethan, or at least she tried to. Fueled by rage but slowed by her weight, Maggie barely got 2 steps before she stumbled forward. Just as she was about to regain her balance, flashing red and blue lights filled the street. The police had arrived. It turned out Maggie had been making threats online ever since the article dropped, spewing hateful messages and even vowing to retaliate against whoever exposed her. Someone had reported her behavior, and the authorities had been keeping an eye on her. As soon as the officer stepped out, Maggie panicked. "This is all fake," she screamed. "He's trying to make me look bad. I'm the victim here." But when they moved toward her, she did the last thing anyone expected. She ran. It was almost comical, Maggie, red-faced and sweating, trying to flee from trained officers. She made it about 20 feet before she tripped on the curb, crashing to the ground. Within seconds, she was surrounded. "You're under arrest for making false reports and attempted assault," an officer said as they cuffed her. Ethan just stood there, watching as she was hauled into the squad car. For the first time in weeks, he felt a sense of peace. Maggie had spent her whole life believing she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. Today, that changed, and he had made sure of it. Maggie had always thought of herself as untouchable. Rules were for other people. Consequences were something she'd never had to face. But as she sat in the courtroom, hands clasped together, her face still blotchy from the previous night's stress, it started to sink in. She was in real trouble. The courtroom was packed. A few reporters sat in the back, whispering as they jotted down notes. Local residents, including some of Ethan's neighbors, had come to watch the proceedings unfold. Even Ethan himself was there, sitting calmly near the front, arms crossed, watching everything. Then the door opened, and the judge walked in. Maggie's breath caught in her throat. The judge was black. For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. She had spent her entire life looking down on people like him. Now, he was the one deciding her fate. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Everyone stood as Judge Harris took his seat. He was a tall, composed man with sharp eyes that immediately landed on Maggie. He shuffled through his papers, then looked up. "Miss Thompson," he said, his voice firm, "you are being charged with trespassing, filing false police reports, and attempted assault. How do you plead?" Maggie swallowed hard. Her lawyer nudged her, whispering something under his breath. She barely heard him. The room was hot. Too many eyes were on her. She could feel sweat trickling down the back of her neck. "Not guilty," she muttered, her voice cracking. Judge Harris didn't react. He simply nodded and turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed." The next 30 minutes were brutal. The prosecutor laid out everything: Maggie's history of harassment, the false 911 call, her threats, and, of course, the moment she tried to run from the police. Witnesses, including Ethan, testified. The security footage of her throwing a tantrum by the pool was played. Maggie squirmed in her seat, her face going from red to pale. Then the judge spoke. "Miss Thompson, I have to say, your actions are some of the most brazen examples of entitlement and discrimination I've seen in this courtroom. You repeatedly trespassed, attempted to weaponize law enforcement against an innocent man, and showed blatant disregard for the law. Given your history, I have serious concerns about your behavior. Do you have anything to say for yourself before I proceed with sentencing?" That was when Maggie lost it. She shot up from her seat, her chair screeching against the floor. "This is bullshit," she screamed. "You're all against me. This whole damn thing is rigged. That thug set me up." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Her lawyer put his head in his hands. "Miss Thompson," Judge Harris said coolly, "I strongly suggest you control yourself." Maggie ignored him. She jabbed a finger in his direction. "You're just another affirmative action hire. You shouldn't even be a judge." The room went dead silent. Then she said the one thing that sealed her fate. "I swear, if I ever see you outside this courtroom." Bailiffs were on her before she could finish, grabbing her arms as she thrashed. Judge Harris remained unshaken. He simply adjusted his glasses and picked up his gavel. Given your blatant disrespect for this court and your threats against a sitting judge, I am extending your sentence beyond what was originally recommended, he said firmly. Maggie's face crumpled. No, you can't do that. But it was too late. The gavel came down with a sharp bang. Sentencing will be issued immediately. Maggie had dug her own grave, and now she had to lie in it. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as Maggie was dragged out, still kicking and screaming. But there was nothing she could do now. The judge's ruling was final. Her fate was sealed. Maggie was sentenced to 1 year in jail for trespassing, filing false police reports, and threatening a judge. What was originally a minor case had spiraled into something much bigger, all because she couldn't control her own hatred. News of the incident spread like wildfire. The story made its way to social media, where people wasted no time tearing Maggie apart. The video of her courtroom meltdown racked up millions of views in just days. Memes flooded the internet. Imagine being racist and dumb enough to threaten a judge, one user wrote. Plot twist. She thought the pool was free, but jail is really free, another joked. Reporters started digging into her past. The skeletons in her closet were exposed for the world to see. Her family's KKK ties, her history of harassing black neighbors, and even old complaints from past jobs about her racist behavior. Maggie was officially canceled. Meanwhile, Ethan was finally at peace. For the first time in months, he could enjoy his pool without worry. He no longer had to deal with Maggie sneaking in, complaining, or calling the cops. The entire neighborhood, tired of Maggie's antics, rallied behind him. One weekend, his neighbors surprised him with a small celebration. They set up decorations, brought over food, and gathered around his pool. It wasn't just about Maggie anymore. It was about standing up against racism and supporting one another. Ethan smiled as he looked around. He had bought this home to live in peace, and now that's exactly what he had. As for Maggie, she sat in a cold jail cell, no pool in sight, no one to bail her out. She had spent her life looking down on others, but now she was at the lowest point imaginable. And karma had no sympathy for people like her. Ethan's life returned to normal, but the experience had changed him. He became more involved in his community, speaking out against racism and supporting local initiatives to promote equality. His story inspired others to stand up against injustice, and his neighborhood became a symbol of unity and resilience. Maggie, on the other hand, served her time in jail, but her life was never the same. She lost her job, her friends, and her reputation. When she was released, she moved away, hoping to start over. But the internet never forgets, and her past followed her wherever she went. In the end, Ethan's pool became more than just a symbol of his success. It became a symbol of justice. And as he sat by the water, watching the sunset, he knew that he had made a difference. Not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever faced discrimination. The pool of justice had spoken, and its message was clear: no one is above the law. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.